in Midcoast Maine, roughly covering the period from 1720 forward. We'll begin at the beginning of water power use in Maine, which is 1720. This is a work that's still in progress, and so I'd like to share with you some of my ongoing exploration into what factors favored the development of settlements in Midcoast Maine, and in this case, it's the role of water power. So first, setting the stage a bit with some my talking about some of these features. Then we'll view some old mill photos and a few notes on them, and then follow that with a few resources, and then we can begin to address questions that folks may have, and I will do my very best to answer. And as she is recording this, we may have a way to track those unanswered questions and follow up if need be. So, to begin, in opening their lands in 1719 and 1720, after the disastrous Indian warfare seemed to be over, the proprietors of the Muscongas or Lincolnshire patent set as their first on-site goals the confirmation of their Indian deed from the sachem Medakawando and the establishment of a settlement on their claim. Accordingly, we read in the diary of young Thomas Fairweather, who was holder of one part of one of the shares in this patent or grant, Boston, 18th of April, 1720. This day at the meeting of the Lincolnshire Company at the Green Dragon Tavern, it was agreed that 3 of the members of said society should embark on board their sloop Seaflower, whereof James Peat master, and proceed with cattle, mill gear, workmen, and so forth, for Muscongas and St. George's rivers, and so forth, in order to begin a settlement and also to procure a confirmation of their deeds for said land from the present Sagamore, and also to view the land, it being voted by the said company that Thomas Smith and Thomas Fairweather should go in said sloop to Piscataqua and take in the Honorable Thomas Westbrook, Esquire, with what he should put on board, and so proceed according to instructions from the committee of said company. Okay. Thursday, 28th of April, 1 p.m., with 7 millwrights on board and ready, sailed for Muscongas, reached Black Point at break of day, the 29th, anchored, sent boat on shore for 2 workmen to carry to Muscongas. Only one went on board. Now, note that mill gear is a prominent part of their load of equipment, and that there were 7 millwrights aboard. The diarist, Thomas Fairweather, was owner of a half-share in the grant, and he was the husband of Hannah Waldo. We should also observe that Thomas Westbrook was one of the proprietors as well as a prominent lumberman. The Waldo family also had lumber interests. And so it began. After scouting out the Muscongas River in the western margin of their grant, this small group sailed up the fjord-like estuary of the St. George River, and exploring the streams that flowed into the head of the estuary, settled on a location a short way up what they heard as the Squidcommagig River, which they then called our Mill Creek. And so it remains named Mill River today. They immediately unloaded their mill gear and workmen to start construction while they negotiated with the tribes. Despite initial resistance from the natives involved, they persisted and began the small settlement of Lincoln in the head of the estuary in Thomaston, where Lyman Morse's boatyard is today. In 1722, the settlement of the sloop and the mill were destroyed in a fiery raid at the beginning of Lovewell's War. The blockhouse which had been built there was reconstructed into a fort, which remained with modifications until the end of the French and Indian War in the 1760s. In 1729, there was a new attempt at a settlement, but Colonel David Dunbar's colony of Sagodahawk, which was superimposed on the Muscongas of Lincolnshire Grant and several others, complicated further resettlement until Samuel Waldo persuaded the British authorities in England to dissolve the superimposed grant, and in gratitude, the proprietors gave him an undivided half of the Muscongas grant, which they all owned in undivided portions. And in gratitude, the proprietors began their work, and Waldo began to bring in settlers in 1730s, with the first new settlement being in Warren, called Upper St. George, followed in 1740 by a settlement at Broad Bay, which became Waldoboro on the Medomak, thus beginning exploitation of the water power of the Medomak as well. Other settlement had taken place nearby much earlier in Pemaquid and Bristol in 1635. And that was anchored by the various disturbances by the fort at Pemaquid and some private blockhouses. My own folk came first to Bristol in the 1760s and then to Hope in the 1790s as millwrights and millers. Now, how did these sawmills operate?
Go ahead and use the arrows on your keyboard. It'll help you advance a little easier.
Thank you. These hints are so helpful. Here we're looking at a very good illustration by Edwin Tunis for his book, Colonial Living. And this shows the essential gearing and eccentric arm necessary to drive a vertical sawmill. This one is a triple gang sawmill, which also automatically advances the timber with each pound of saw. Now, note the great amount of wood all through here, as opposed to the very small amount of metal needed for the construction of such a mill, which made it more feasible to set up on the frontier. So here's some of the metal parts, a shaft, something to engage the shaft and lock it, a few bolts, here this mechanism to raise and lower the shuttle, the saws themselves, and this gear here, which was very important, a few bolts over here. The rest is wood. And what happens, how this works is water comes down the sluiceway. Its flow is controlled by this gate and this little handle over here. As you raise and lower this sluice, you control the flow, which advances this mill accordingly, driving this cage gear, which engages with this peg wheel here. Whoops, we have to go back there. Engages with this pegged wheel here, which then moves this way. And on the shaft that's driven by that gear, it sits this eccentric arm. And so this arm goes up and down like this and moves this creature up and down, flexing at this point. So this little cage here contains the saws. And as it goes up and down, the cage moves this lever, which pushes this thing down, which advances the wood on this carriage. It's a very simple mechanism running through. And it advances whatever log is on the mill through the process. So let's see. Now, let's have a look at some of the other locations where mills were built. Some of them were this vertical sawmill. In fact, the vertical sawmill held force until about 1840, when a woman somewhere in this country invented a circular saw. And it was so much more efficient than the up and down motion that it quickly replaced the others. But here's a map that was drawn in the 1790s for General Knox as he was planning to develop his land. It's a little peculiar in that it only shows rivers where they cross roads and where they are in General Knox's own lands. So it's a little difficult to catch the rivers. Up here in Camden, you can see, here's Goose River coming across from Goose River Harbor in the area that eventually became Rockport. Up here is Camden Harbor, which now takes in this piece of Canaan plantation as well. So here are the early roads. Here is Route 1, which was then called the County Road in the old manuscripts. Over here in Warren is the Western Road. Over here in Warren is the Middle Road. This was actually an old Indian trail, which went up along Senebec and out over through Peabody Road in Appleton. This part labeled Thomaston is actually divided up into what is now Rockland here, Thomaston and South Thomaston. There's Rockland Harbor. There's the harbor at Goose River, now Rockport. And here's Megunticook. Just to orient you, the mills here, pink is a sawmill, a sawmill, a sawmill, a sawmill, a sawmill, one down here, and a grist mill here. This is quickly followed in 1802 period, not very long afterward, by a map drawn by Osgood Carleton. His was the first reliable map of the whole state of Maine. Its production began with the publication of James Sullivan's History of the District of Maine in 1795. Sullivan was also governor of Massachusetts and Maine at that time, the undivided territory, except for the piece that came through from New Hampshire. And I've added orange markers here for sawmills. Now, here we are up on the Megunticook. Those are probably right at the position of Molinos mills. And there's a grist mill and a sawmill there. Here in the mouth of the Megunticook, we've got a grist mill shown. That's about 1768. Here's the site of the earliest mill, the top of the harbor in Thomaston, where the estuary begins to turn the corner. In the 1730s, here's one that was put up over and on Oyster River by one of the Lermans. Opposite at the falls here in Warren is a sawmill. Over here we have that quintessential pair, a sawmill and a grist mill in a couple of places up in Waldoboro area. North Waldoboro up here, a couple of sawmills here. Let's go to the next one here. Oops, it goes there. Now, how did all of this happen? Well, let's just turn to another note. The people who were engaged in all of this mill work and clearing of land were very distant from non-meat food sources and from materials for clothing. And the earliest settlers had to be as self-sufficient as possible, providing shelter, growing their own food, raising their own cattle, and cultivating fiber, flax and wool, to make their own cloth. As the forests were cleared, land became available for agriculture, and early crops, including grains, could be planted between the stumps. Hence the slow following of the sawmills by the grist mills. and the gentler land and wet meadows became croplands, meadows, and pastures for livestock. The rougher, steeper, boulder-covered land provided grazing for sheep and goats. With the sheep and goats came a need for carding mills, mills that aligned the wool in strands to prepare it, called roving, for hand spinning into thread, and later, in the 1800s, after Francis Cabot introduced the necessary techniques into New England, large water-powered mills, such as the ones at Warren and Camden, began to produce finished fabrics under one roof. In time, water power was employed to operate blowers, rolling machineries, and grinders at streamside foundries in places such as Waldoboro, Union, and Camden. The water power provided by these rivers, both tide mills in estuaries and mills on streams and rivers, were the tools that supplied energy for major tasks: lumbering, threshing and grinding grain, carding wool, later weaving and fulling cloth, and operating cabinet and furniture making shops and other woodworking shops. The bark piles of the lumber mills supported tanneries, and leather could be made from the hides of cattle and swine. In the places where foundries were established, powered trip hammers used in forging metal. And as marble was discovered and quarried in Thomaston, water power provided a short-lived mill that sliced the large blocks into fine slabs and also operated polishing machinery. It also provided power for the gunpowder mills here in Camden and elsewhere, mills that facilitated lime quarrying operations, as well as making gunpowder for hunting in for the militia, and of course, for shipment of items ranging from produce to lime, barrels were needed. There were many small, often seasonal mills making staves and headers for barrels. At a local farm industry for the off-season was a proliferation of cooper's shops to assemble the barrels. At first, most of these activities, except the lumbering, were at a subsistence level, but with the increasing availability of water power, efficiency of productivity increased, and this mid-coast area became able to produce its products of forest and field, to make its own tools, and to export its own productions through marine vessels made in its own shipyards. One of the first major wood-based industries, indeed, was the construction of ships with the lumber from the forests and mills. These ships were used in commerce around the world, but they also supported the local fishing and lumber interests. Maine's water powers on the major rivers ultimately provided power for very large mills, which imported eventually substantial amounts of cotton from the south and exported cloth to the rest of the country and the world. Mills also provided power for factories of many descriptions, some of which I've already described. And the shipments that were sent around the world and down coast to the States were largely in locally built vessels. Now, early harnessing of water power was via the well-known water wheels, an overshot wheel, a breast wheel where the water came partway up the wheel and it was forced under the wheel as it cascaded down a curved surface, and through undershot wheels where the stream just simply flowed under the wheel. But fairly soon it was discovered that it could be used more efficiently through the use of cast iron turbines, some versions of which were developed by Montville's Smith Cram. Now, an early water turbine presently operates in Union at Morgan's Mills, and as Richard Morgan tells me, such a turbine was also used in my family's former mill in South Hope. And both of those turbines are dated in 1820. Now, how was the lumber extracted from the forest? By skilled workmen, brute force, horses, and oxen. This is Cyrus Racine's logging team, ready for morning's work on the farm that my family had out in Searsmont. Good animal power, well-trained animal power, and skilled lumbermen were very, very important in this interest. Now, here are some of the early mills over in Montville. On the left is Prescott's Mill. It began life as True's Mill in the early 1800s, later became a grist mill. In its last operation, it was William Prescott's machine shop, where he made wagon and carriage wheels. And on the other side of this mill, just downstream, here's the headworks of the mill, and water's flowing through the mill here in the wheel here, and down a sluiceway to this mill. Ted Cram constructed that as a barrel mill, to which he later added a grist mill. And it was powered, as I say, by the downstream flow in the sluice from the upstream mill that was built by True. These and many other mills went out on the floods of 1936, which destroyed dams and mills cascading down the river. Over here across the river, by the way, whoops, did I do that? Across the river is a gun shop operated by the Peavy brothers, where they made pistols. Lots of local ingenuity going on as these industries began to develop. Here's another view of the mill, and it has several features that I'd like to point out to you. First of all is this cribwork dam. A cribwork of logs held together, they're going to cross the river like this, were held together by logs pinned under piles of rocks behind. And then there was a facing here to allow water and logs that would go over the dam to not catch up in the dam itself. Probably the back side of the dam was also covered with some kind of boarding to allow the logs to slide up and over. Here you have boarding that's raised. You see these upright stakes. You could slip in boards to raise the water level of the dam. Over here is the headworks, which you saw before. And underneath this whole side of the mill, where all of the supports are, is boarded in to keep logs from taking out the timbers that hold the mill up. Only part of the mill, as you can see, is on the bank. The rest is suspended on timbers set on flat rocks in the riverbed. Here's the sluiceway going down to the next mill. And this is the next mill down in one view. Lumber or logs piled up ready to go. Logs being brought in by ox cart. Here's the mill crew. Over here is Ted Cram, proprietor of this mill. Over here is William Prescott, proprietor of the upstream mill. And back here is a new addition that's been added to the stave and heading mill to make barrels, which is a grist mill. And here's a downstream view of Cram's mill. Note that he's continued the boarding, and see the timbers as they're set into the riverbed, and then linked by timbers to the foundation on the bank. You can see why in a heavy, heavy flood, some of these mills might easily be taken out. Downstream on St. George is the falls at Searsmont. And on one side of the falls, there's a sluiceway that feeds the Wings Mill, which was a wool carding mill at the beginning, and later became a grist mill. And the fact that there are so many wool carding mills around talks a little bit about the commerce that grew up on the land that was cleared, where quite a number of sheep had been brought in to supply wool for making cloth. On the other side of this river is Bean's Mill, originally here and then extended up the bank here with its own sluiceway feeding the works, the mill wheels. And note there's the bridge here. There's also a bridge between the mills and most areas, because you had to be able to go from one side of the dam to the other, whether it was a footbridge or whether it was a bridge, as in this case, a truss bridge which carried traffic over the river. In Searsmont, the commerce that grew up from these early mills was very productive. There was a milling center. There were other mills up and down the river besides these. And there was a busy stop where two stagecoach routes crossed. And there were 3 hotels and a huge 4-story dry goods store and dance hall. I remember the dance hall when I was a child. Downriver was Dyer's Mill, which later became Robbins Mill and is still Robbins Mill area. You see the river coming down. Note this interesting vertical crib work here, a substantial dam with a vertical face. Here's the sluiceway bringing water into the mill works underneath. See the same kind of siding here to keep things from getting at the timbers, moving logs and so forth, getting at the timbers of the mill. Now, the Robbins family had this mill for quite a while, but it burned, and they reconstructed the old building, but the lamb is long gone. The turbine is in the Barn Museum at the Searsmont Historical Society, and the mill operations have moved downstream across the road and the other side of the river to a state-of-the-art electrically driven mill. The new mill uses wood waste to generate some of the necessary power for its operation, and it also feeds into the grid. This is a new emerging pattern in the world of Maine mills. In North Appleton, further down the St. George River, there was quite an interesting mill complex, very productive, and the source of an interesting local economy. A much less sleepy village than it is today. You see here the yard of the long lumber mill, and then here is a penstock feeding a header mill, and here's some of its production behind it, and waste on the side, and a header and staff mill, and then the old canal, which was begun back in 1795 and then continued on into the early 1800s by Henry Knox, and then reestablished somewhat later. It ran during the late 40s and early 1850s. So the canal came through here carrying produce from this area in Searsmont Falls all the way down the Senebec. Across behind that staff mill is the 1812 general store, a substantial structure with its warehouse barn. Across the road is a farmhouse, and then coming back toward us on the left-hand side of the road is a cheese factory with a dance hall upstairs and another store at the left side of the picture. Over behind all of this, there was a nice little village around a church, which now no longer exists. Down here is McLean's Mills in what's known as Appleton Village. This is Senebec Road, which is a continuation of that middle road that eventually came up all the way into Searsmont, but ran through above the hills here over to Peabody Road and Magog Road of today. McLean's Mills was one of the very early ones in the late 1700s, and it was owned by Archibald and Fergus McLean. Their houses sit on each side of the river. There was a store right here that was owned by another one of the partners in the mill, Almond Gushy. And in the 1870s, another mill was constructed on the opposite bank, the Horace Titus grist mill, fed by another sluiceway down the side. And it had downstream dependencies. In the background behind the tree is Fergus McLean's house, one of the two mill owners, prime mill owners. Let's see, we're going backwards here. There. One of the curiosities that appears is occasionally a note on the construction, and I would like you to know that that dam that supplied those two mills in Appleton in 1833 cost $28.50 to build. Currency of that time. And running from the little mill pond, which feeds the Georges River via Allen Brook out in Appleton, just on the hills between Appleton and Hope, was Sherman's Mill. There is currently a reconstructed mill on the same site, but you can tell that it was a very productive long lumber mill in the early 1900s even. And the ridge behind provided a great deal of the lumber. And over here, the house right there is probably the oldest house in that area, and maybe the oldest house in Appleton. It was the old Simmons place. Now, Morgan's Mill is on a branch that feeds into the St. George River from Alford Lake and Lerman's Pond. And there, John Lerman built a sawmill at the outlet from the pond in the late 1800s. In about 1803, he constructed a dam further downstream, which is just under this bridge abutment that you see here and going back to the right. And he built this mill here. And it has milled grain, lumber, stone with the addition of the section over here. And now it's been restored to service by Richard Morgan, and again operates and mills grain as Morgan's Mills. At one point in its history, it had two sluiceways and two turbines, one in each of these two buildings. The remaining 1820 turbine is in the left-hand building, and it's linked to a generator, which provides power to operate an electrically driven mill in the building on the right, behind here. And excess electric power is going to the grid. Down in South Hope, on a stream flowing from Hobbs Pond and through Fish Pond, came the source of water for Fish's Mills. And Fish's Mills later became the South Hope Manufacturing Company, as you see here. This is what the sign says, South Hope Manufacturing. It sits on the side of the small pond that's there now, fed by a dam over in this area. Here, the stream flows down, and this little dam here was pounding this water up a bit. And here is Route 17 of today, with the old South Hope Church here. During its day, this mill passed through the hands of several owners after the fishes, and it made furniture and sashes and blinds and other useful products. It ended up as the South Hope Manufacturing Company, as I've said, and they produced carriages and buggy whips, as well as all these other things. And as one of their Concord buggies can be seen in the Hope Historical Society's barn. The picture is in the early 1900s. Just downstream on the other side of Route 17 was the site where Ephraim Bowley set up a mill about 1804. And he and his sons built a sawmill on Quiggle Brook, which flows out of that little mill pond and eventually drains into Crawford Pond and into the St. George. In about 1820, it was converted to a turbine mill, and eventually Halver Hart purchased the millwrights and rebuilt the dam and moved the upper stories of the old South Hope Manufacturing Company across Route 17 down onto this site. And you see here is the upper story of the old South Hope Manufacturing during the very active period of operation of Halver Hart's mill. That facility is still there. It's currently in process of restoration. But the mill pond and the lumber yards that you see here have all grown up into quite a thick growth of trees. Over on Mansfield Pond, which feeds into the Alford Lake and Learmond Pond headwaters, is the Mansfield Brook Mill. Here, Dick Brodus gives you an idea of the scale of some of the stonework for the dam and the foundations of the mill. Another local industry was the production of agricultural equipment locally. Here, the Cole family invented and reconstructed a very, very large variety of agricultural and horse-powered machinery. And their house is still in the banks above, but the mills are long gone. Another stream feeding into the St. George's River was that at Chickawaukee. Chickawaukee was originally called Medomak, which you will see in the old writings, and then after Isaac Tolman built this mill at the outlet, it was called Tolman's Pond, and then later on named Chickawaukee. Tolman's mills were very important in the settlement of this part of Rockland and other areas nearby. And eventually they and Chickawaukee Pond, or Tolman's to Chickawaukee, were part of the waterworks that supplied Rockland. Over on the Medomak River, there were 3 small mills on a stream feeding the Medomak, and then 2 mills on the upper Medomak area in Appleton. And this was the foundation of the early prosperity of Burkettville. That was the original village center of the town of Appleton before the chunk of Hope was added to it, containing the St. George Valley. And so people still fondly refer to it out there as the capital of Appleton. The mill proprietor was Andrew Burkett, and others followed, owning the mill, including the Lenskits and the Luces. And now we move to another outflow, curiously enough, partially fed by the headwaters of the St. George's River, as Hobbs Pond drains into the upper end of both the streams and ponds feeding the St. George and Megunticook Lake. So right at the mouth of the river, here in Camden is the Alden Anchor Factory. They began making at a foundry there large marine anchors, many tons worth. They were at one point the only anchor factory on the East Coast. Now, the town's other foundry, the Knowlton Company, was located a bit further up the Megunticook River, over behind the village. And the original mill in the area was Minot's Mill at the outlet of the river, what's now called Montgomery Dam, which you can see right at the edge of the harbor between the library and the area across the village where the town landing is. This area here burned during the 1930s and was given by Mary Buck to the town and used as a town landing now. Now, I have always had a question about Camden. Why did the 20 associates select the lands they did? Which, as you may see in this portion of the old Knox map, is Camden, Barrettstown, or now Hope, Appleton, what became Liberty, and over here, Montville. It goes inland at a very odd angle. And then I realized, oh, this is very interesting. Here is where Megunticook River comes in the side, and Megunticook River flows into Megunticook Pond here, and so the complete flow of the Megunticook River, which is a very powerful source coming down from the lake as it does, dropping in 3 miles, 50 feet. Then up here, it includes in the part of Hope, which was transferred later to Appleton, the St. George's River, a substantial flow. And then up here in Liberty, it captures the headwaters of the St. George River and feeds stream through Liberty and into Montville, which capture much of the flow of the river, all on the 20 associates' lands, providing a major economic resource for these 5 towns that were made from the land they selected. So that odd angle of coming in from the ocean from a point on this coast here, this is so-called Rock XX and Rock XV down here on Jameson's Point. These were the outer boundaries, 5¼ miles across here, that delineated the shape of these 100,000 acres that became those 5 towns. They had a solid economic foundation for the future of the town, capturing all of that water flow that they did. And one of the mills that grew up here, of course, is the Knox Woolen Mill. This is much later than those early mills, but it eventually became the sole source of the endless felt belts that supplied the main paper mills and paper manufacturing in various places around the world. And you can note its scale compared with some of the other mills you've seen by the people on the roof here. And remember this tower here as we look at the next picture. This is an architect's rendering of the building complex that grew up around the early mill, which you can see in the foreground. Here, if I can get that arrow back, is that tower, now all wrapped by other building. And water to power this section, this facility, came through water impounded by this dam here and into a channel which runs under all of these buildings and powered several turbines along the way, linked to a complex of belts and line shafts and pulleys all through the structure. So each of the floors could have its own a line shaft supplying power to machinery. Upstream was Gould's plug mill, which made those wooden deadeye blocks that were used in marine vessel rigging. And the site was later taken over by another essential industry, the tannery. And tanneries provided leather from local and imported animal hides, and they could use the byproducts of the lumber mills, the hemlock and oak bark in particular. But later on, they began using other chemicals for tanning, and that began to result in the accumulation of toxic wastes on this site. And the tannery has since been taken down, and the site has been cleaned up for other uses, as we see in our daily papers. Over here was a fascinating mill. This is Bisbee Marble and Company's powder mill. And you might wonder, why a powder mill? A gunpowder mill. And from its earliest years, Camden and many other local carried lime. And it was convenient to get the necessary blasting powder from a local supplier. For less distance you had to transfer that powder and transport it over rough roads, the less chance you had of mishap, among other things, but it was also economically convenient. And Bisbee Marble and Company provided that for this area of the Midcoast. And these facilities had heavy timber frames and a roof, and they loosely hung board walls which could blow outwards when the occasional explosion would take place, and which were readily replaced afterwards. And so it was quite a complex with about 12 or 13 buildings at one time. Upstream a little further is Seabright Mill, and this is one of the many textile mills in Camden, located on the Megunticook River in the area now called Millville. And we come up to the original second dam, or second set of mills in Camden. Molyneux's Mills, there's dams still there. Here, the only resident proprietor of the Lincolnshire Grant, William Molyneux and his wife Mary, came and settled right at this location, building mills on either side of the ledge in the middle of the stream that flows out of Megunticook Lake. They are keyed into the ledge, securely anchored, and they raised also the water level 14 to 18 feet. And that vastly increased the volume of water already stored in the lake, the benefit for all the millers that followed Molyneux. He had that wonderful pair of facilities, a grist mill and a lumber mill, on either side of that bedrock island in midstream. And if you look at the old maps, you'll see the various shapes of Megunticook Lake because of the changes in water level by the dam. And I would like to now identify a local activity which you might engage in Camden. This wonderful guide was prepared by Jennifer Healy, and it's available at the Camden Public Library in the History Center. There are several numbers of copies ready for folks. It's about a 20-minute walk, and you can see some 19 historic mill locations with 11 varied structures of local mills. Another excellent resource, the so-called Bible of water power in Maine, is this one by Walter Wells, which originally was published in 1869 by the state, after compiling an extensive hydrological survey under Wells and a survey of facilities, mill facilities in each town. This one was reprinted by Forgotten Books in 2017, and you can get it on Amazon. Other electronic versions are available. And here is a current mill restoration project going on in Bristol. As I mentioned, Bristol had very early on a mill on the river, in fact. The Old Bristol Historical Society, working under Phil Averill, who was chair of the mill committee, has a project to restore this old water-powered mill at Pemaquid Falls. There's a significant source of power along the Pemaquid River, and this is one of many mill sites along the river, one of the very last to be closed. So when the project is finished, in addition to the restored mill, the Old Bristol Historical Society will have a historical resource center and archival storage and buildings associated with the mill. So I have provided here the link to Old Bristol Historical Society, where you might find further information on that. And I'm sure Phil and the mill committee folks would be very happy to talk with you about any interest you may have in that area. And so.
Thank you so much, Donovan. That is very clear that you have thoroughly researched this subject. And at this point, I'd love to open it up to some questions to you, if that's okay. Folks, if you have any questions, the best way to communicate with Donovan would be to please type them into the chat box. You can access that by clicking at the bottom of your screen on the little icon that says chat. Donovan, we did have a couple questions already come in. The first one is from Joel, and it says, how did the powder mills utilize the water power? You'll need to unmute. There we go. Donovan, let's get you unmuted so we can hear you.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I can't answer very much on that. I will have to do some more research to find out how they did it. But clearly you had to grind the ingredients to a uniform size in order to make an effective mix of particles of the various things that went into making the powder. And you had to have a way of combining and mixing the resultant material. So you have a turning shaft in these mills, and a turning shaft can be used by a competent mechanic to do all kinds of amazingly different things, running a variety of machinery. I don't know what their machinery looked like, but I will see if I can find out.
Super. We have another question that says, where did the iron come from for the Alden Anchor Factory in Camden?
Again, I don't know where Alden got its anchor iron, but I do know that most of the early iron smelting facilities used bog iron, which they could obtain locally. And there were various areas of interest where iron was extracted. Probably the biggest nearby one that is familiar to people and which can be visited would be the old Saugus Iron Works in Saugus, Massachusetts. There is a very large deposit of bog iron, which is continually being renewed in the Pine Barrens area of New Jersey, where they have been rotating excavations around the site over the years and letting new bog iron be deposited in the abandoned and dug out areas over time. In Sharon, Massachusetts, there was a very huge deposit of bog iron, which is now known, I believe, as Lake Massapogue, a huge lake in the town of Sharon. So There were deposits all over here. In the earliest explorations by Henry Knox agency under Monsieur Montville, who was a French geologist employed to do natural history work by Knox, who stayed incidentally with one of my great uncles during the time he was conducting that survey for Knox, over in Thomaston along the river. He traveled all over by foot and by horseback through the area of the Lincolnshire Grant, and particularly Knox's lands, noting the natural history, the tree growth in particular areas, the occurrence of various minerals, and particularly wherever iron ore might be found.
We had another person mention, Andrew mentioned Katahdin Iron Works also.
Yes, of course, Katahdin Iron Works.
We have several more questions. I'll get through, see how many we can get through. This one is a little off topic. It says, just curious, did Donovan give the commencement talk at Camden Rockport High School in 1984?
No, he did not.
No, okay.
He was totally occupied in several other places at the time.
Well, it must have been something that reminded this person of you. This next question is, have you come across old photos or written history of the Skidmore Road sawmill on the Union-Washington line along the Medomak River?
I haven't come across any records. I haven't explored that area yet. As I said, this is work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very curious about the varied sites and various types of structures and mills that went in. And so I've shown you a chunk of what I have so far. But the property may be one of those three mills that were described in Walter Wells's Water Powers of Maine as being on a tributary of the Medomak.
Okay. Jane has a statement. She said, I believe a Shaker woman invented the circular saw. So thank you for that.
I have heard two versions of that, and my understanding always was that it was a Shaker woman who invented it. Certainly the Shakers took full advantage of it in their operations, but I've been told by others that it was a different woman, not a Shaker. So, however, the involvement of female wiles in the construction of a rotating saw certainly is part of the history.
Oh, absolutely. And I appreciate that it was a woman who tried to do things a little more efficiently. Okay, we've got another question that came in. It says, I am interested in something called a steam mill, which seems to have been used tome staves in Lincolnville in the 1850s and maybe even earlier.
Sure. Around the area, there are various places called Slab City and Slab City Road going through Slab City areas. Steam mills came into fashion in the late 1800s and early 1900s because they could be hauled to a site on land without the need for water power. There just had to be enough water to be able to keep the boiler supplied. But you could set it up in a forest and bring lumber right from that forest to that mill without much overland transport. There were several different reasons why that might be more easily done, less complicated. There is one of these little postcard view books that's been reprinted is one of lumbering operations in Midcoast Maine. And on the cover is, I believe, a picture of Ted Cram and a crew operating a steam-powered mill, probably somewhere out in the Montville, Liberty area. It's one of Frank Cunningham's photos.
Okay. Well, again, I want to mention to folks that if they have any additional questions, our time's just about up, but if you have any additional questions that you'd like to ask Donovan, you can go ahead and email them to me. I'm the same person who sent you the link, and I will go ahead and forward those to Donovan. We had a number of people who asked some questions ahead of the program, sent some photos for him to take a look at. So I'm sure he'd be happy to take a look at that stuff for you. Donovan, we've had some compliments come in, folks thanking you and saying that it was fun and interesting. And I also want to thank you. That was very, very thorough and just so important to know about how our area came to be the way it has and all the industries that contributed to it. So
and you can see how mills were perhaps a driving force in the economic development of the area, because they brought in outside money, and they brought in the building of ships and the encouragement of commerce, and they allowed transport into the area of livestock and a variety. You know, it kept unfolding and unfolding.
Yeah, and they were just clearly the fundamental building blocks to get the whole area going. So thank you again for bringing us some insight into that.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you all.
I did want to mention again, it's History Month, so we have a lot of different history programs coming up, and they're extremely varied. We're going to be talking about Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. We're going to be talking about the American Revolution, and we're going to have a program about muskets that were used during that time period. So check out librarycamden.org. Let me know if you see anything else you'd like to attend, and I'm happy to send you a link. Donovan, again, thank you so much, and
thank you.
I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Be well.
We will.